Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Digital Inclusion and 2030 Development Goals conversation. We have titled our event Halfway and Hopeful, and we'll get into unpacking why that is the case in just a moment. My name is Hazami Barmada, and I will introduce myself and our wonderful panelists shortly, but I wanted to start by giving you guys a quick overview of the agenda of the conversation for today. So our conversation today, initially, we're going to talk about the 2023 Global Development Goals, also known as the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, and specifically looking at the intersection of the SDGs with digital inclusion. Then we're going to open it up for a larger conversation around why this is relevant, looking at digital equity as a lens through which we should look at social and economic development, but then also trying to better understand where are we failing, where are we not making enough progress, and where are we making progress, and where can we scale and invest into more opportunities to create more equity. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So there is Q&A box. Feel free to type messages for us in there. We'll try to get to them through this presentation. All right, to start us off with, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the Digital Equity Accelerator, which is an initiative that was launched in 2022 that specifically looks at investing into nonprofit organizations that are fueling social innovation to address injustices in their communities, specifically looking at social and economic injustice around the pillars of healthcare, education, and access to economic opportunities. And we'll get into why that is important. But we look specifically at nonprofit organizations that are addressing the inequality that is exacerbated by unequal access and use of technology. And in the day and age that we're living in today, which we're going to unpack a little further, a lot of our world is digital. And in a post-COVID world, and in some parts of the world still grappling with COVID, we started to see the importance of technology in a way that maybe we've been able to not see prior. But to date, the accelerator has operated and is operating in 6 countries with investing into 17 organizations. And we really look at investing in organizations holistically, so specifically providing them with capacity building support, with capacity grants, and also hardware grants courtesy of HP, who is our collaborator in this initiative. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists. And we'll just jump straight into the biographies. I'm not going to read them in entirety, so hopefully you guys can skim through this and look people up after the event if you're interested in further follow-up. But I am the director of the Digital Equity Accelerator from the Aspen Institute side, and I come to this work from a long background of doing social impact advocacy work, specifically within big corporations, nonprofit organizations, and the United Nations system. And I will be the host for this conversation today. And then next we have Dr. Francesco, who is the representative of the United Nations Population Fund, also known as UNFPA, currently in Guinea. And Dr. Francesco has an amazing and huge background in multilateral organizations, over 20 years experience at the UN, but also prior to that worked at UN Volunteers and did quite a bit of work on the ground, really looking at the role of civil society and individuals in helping advance social and economic development. And next we have Brighton, and Brighton is the Global Director of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, also known as SDSN, Youth Initiative specifically. Also, we're really excited to have him with us. He works quite a bit also on the grassroots mobilization and specifically innovation aspects of youth solutions to achieve the SDGs in education and partnerships specifically. Very excited to dive more into conversations around the nexus of grassroots mobilization and the SDGs, which to a lot of people are framed often as the UN goals, and we're going to try to debunk why they are not the UN goals. They are indeed the global goals. And lastly, we have Mariama, who is the Digital Equity Accelerator lead on the social impact team at HP, who is my wonderful counterpart at HP. And she works on collaborations and partnerships that help really achieve HP's commitment, which we'll hear about more, to accelerate digital equity for 150 million people by 2030. Also has background experience in multilateral organizations, specifically also the United Nations. So without further ado, I'm going to really quickly touch on what is digital equity, and then we're going to open it up to conversations with the speakers. But digital equity, as we define it at the Aspen Institute and as part of the Accelerator, is a reality where all individuals and communities have the information technology skills and access that they need for full and meaningful inclusion in their societies and economies. And so what we really think about is helping make sure and ensure that communities have the tools they need to be able to fully take advantage of economic, political, and social participation in their societies. And we'll, again, unpack why that is so critical and why we try to move past this idea that digital innovation is, just hip and cool, but rather looking at how so much core services that communities need access to are digitally fueled. And so when you don't give children access to digital literacy, they fall back on their education. They lack economic opportunity or opportunities for employment. So that is a lot of the framing that we use when we start to think about digital equity. And I'm going to dive into a conversation here initially with Francesco. And I'm going to ask you, as we start, to help us understand what are these Sustainable Development Goals, and do you think that the world embraces them and knows what they are today?
Thanks a lot, Hazami, and very happy to be with you all today, and thanks for the opportunity. So I do think that when we look at the substance of the Sustainable Development Goals, what they speak about is really people everyday lives objectives. Because when we talk about being able to go to school, being able to access a meal, 2 meals per day, being able to make a living, to afford one's aspiration and ambitions and so on, we are really talking of the most meaningful situation and reality that human beings would like to see around them. Now, we should not be fooled by the fact that this very down-to-heart and personal level objectives have been translated into a formal agenda, 17 goals and indicators and so on. So in my experience, the better able we are to connect people with the goals in terms of what they mean to their everyday lives, the higher the commitment and engagement to make these goals work for all in an inclusive way and in a way that is very, in a human way. I think that sometimes political agendas get lost in translation into the jargon of politics or policies. But what really matters to people is what these policies want to achieve. And as I was mentioning before, the 16 thematic goals, because the 17th is about partnerships that are necessary to achieve the 16 thematic goals. The 16 thematic goals really talk about the quality of life of everyone and the rights and choices that every individual, every human being can make on this planet. So in this sense, they are known and understood if we engage on them with the everyday lives perspective.
UNDP recently released a report, an annual report that looks at where we are today, and it frames the global climate as, quote, hard to hope. And we know that we have made progress, but we also know that with COVID, we were set back even further on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So can you talk to maybe the size and scope of the problem, and how does the global digital divide impact and further create setback?
Sure. I mean, if we look at the overall situation in terms of progress, it's overwhelmingly depressing, if I may so say. But I think that the strategy when we feel overwhelmed is to take problems and break them into smaller pieces that we can deal with. And I think that this is really the challenge for this decade of action. We are already the third year into the decade of action, right, towards the 2030 deadline. And I think that if we are able as institutions, organizations working on this global agenda to make it meaningful for each individual to undertake the right actions, to adopt the right behaviors, there is room to catch up, not the whole setback that COVID brought about, but definitely to catch up and probably identify what the accelerators are towards at least the achievement of a basic equitable standard for the majority of people on this planet. And definitely digitalization represents one of these possible accelerators, thanks to its power of disintermediation of messages, of access to knowledge, of connection and partnership and joining forces. Because eventually, when we have big goals in front of us, we want to work against those goals together. We want to work against those goals, making the use of the best available knowledge and experience, in this case around the world. And we want to make sure that we make as many people as possible access that. Now, digitalization represents a great opportunity, and I'll give you the example of Guinea. When we look at internet access and access to, the online world, the rate, has gone from, I'm looking at the data here, from 10.7% in 2020 of the population having access to internet to 48.2% in 2022. This is like a dramatic increase, notwithstanding COVID, and I would say probably thanks to COVID, because when COVID forced all of us to be home, and even in developing countries to try and figure out a basic strategy to digitalize certain services and from education or telemedicine, that gave a push. Now, what to do with that push, which was inexistent when we were achieving the better results up to 2019? Because up to 2019, we were set on a good journey, and then 2020 set us back. But 2020 offered us, in the case of Guinea, a 30% of greater increase to the internet, mostly on mobile platforms. So my question is, what are we going to do with this lever now to accelerate the journey towards the achievement of these goals?
Brighton, maybe I want to pull you in here actually as we think around the role of civil society, and to what Francesco was talking about, this idea that COVID allowed us to actually accelerate in some ways, but we also know that marginalized communities fell even further back because the internet and the online world actually exacerbates a lot of the inequalities, the discrimination, the marginalization that we experience, in the real world, if we can call it that, in the physical world today, especially when you're looking at kind of the fact that, for example, a lot of healthcare services and education opportunities are accessed digitally also. Can you speak to the focus on why it's important to invest into, for example, youth-led solutions and or marginalized communities and center their voice in the Sustainable Development Agenda?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm very excited. Are you able to hear me clearly? Excellent. I think Dr. Francesco did provide a very good background to some of the greatest challenges that we are facing with respect to access to digital tools and the digital infrastructure. And I want to open by stating that in the face of the escalating global crisis, we are currently standing at a crossroads. We can either allow technology to widen the existing disparities, or we can decide to provide more sustainable, more equitable solutions, especially for young people that make up close to 1.8 billion of the global population. But I think when we look at the global statistics, sometimes they might not give us a very clear sense of the digital poverty that we are facing, especially in the emerging economies. The global average sometimes, as I said, don't tell the whole story, because we have to think about race, age, disability, socioeconomic status, and locations, which collectively play a role in determining, for example, women's digital access and use. We're also seeing that marginalized groups such as older women, rural women, and women with disabilities face significant greater barriers to connectivity. But at the same time, we see that in the least developed countries, where despite mobile broadband signals covering 76% of the population, we see that only 25% is connected. And in most cases, men are like 52% more likely to be within that online majority. So I think the disparities is what should remind us of who is left behind as we work towards Agenda 2030. When we think about those individuals who are left behind, then we should go back to the back of the line and begin to bring them back. But at the same time, all this makes very clear sense, especially when it comes to like bridging the gap, which will require more than just better, digital infrastructure. I think addressing digital global poverty, for example, will require addressing factors like affordability, access to electricity, online privacy and safety. We need to look at social norms. We also need to look at digital skills and literacy, all of which are mediated by gender. And collectively, all these will be key to getting, and most importantly, young women and girls more meaningfully connected. Recently, the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, released the Common Agenda Report. And following the political declaration adopted at the occasion of the United Nations 75th anniversary, there's a new global digital compact, which is going to form a big part of the Summit of the Future, which is happening next year. I'm very keen to speak to this more in detail in the next few minutes. But I think we have a very huge opportunity to be able to equip the next generation of young leaders with the tools, the skills, the connections they need for them to thrive. I think we'll be doing the future a huge disservice if we decide not to bring them to the front of the line and take a step back, especially current senior leaders in government, civil society, and multilateral institutions. Young people, all they want is to be given space and allowing them to take up key responsibilities while providing them with the mentorship, the skills, especially in terms of unlocking digital opportunities. We are seeing young people who are entrepreneurs, but again, being an entrepreneur in my home country like Zambia will require you to start thinking about how do you get access to cloud services, which sometimes can be very expensive. So I think it will be very critical for us to start thinking about who's left behind. If we identify who's left behind, and then we'll be able to create more meaningful and less tokenistic ways of engaging young people.
Wonderful. And I wanted to just kind of maybe emphasize some of what you said. As of April 2023, you had 5.18 billion internet users worldwide, which is around 65%, a little below 65% of the global population. However, as you said, when you look at that data, it is quite misleading because 93% of the US population is connected to the internet. However, even though that number looks large, rural communities, and as you mentioned, communities of disabilities and what we consider marginalized communities in general, also do not have access to the internet also. We saw in COVID, for example, 1.6 billion students faced learning disruptions due to COVID. But not all students had the ability to actually get online to continue their studies because they did not have a computer at home. So 826 million children and students did not have access to computers to be able to continue their education during COVID. So we do start to see, to the points that you talked about, it's really important to look at the intersection of these challenges when it comes to socioeconomic background, education levels, but then also gender, race, identity, and so on that impact these things. Francesco, I want to go back to you and ask you from the perspective of the world. We often look at these goals as the problem of governments or the problem of the United Nations system, which is made up and composed of member state governments. What is your perspective, given your background, on the global nature of response needed to actually achieve the goals? And can you speak maybe and unpack a little bit around the partnerships that are required with civil society and NGOs to actually make these a reality?
Thanks a lot, Hazami. So I think, that, of course, the Agenda 2030 and the 17 goals that articulate this agenda are a political agenda. So therefore, decision makers have a bigger accountability to steer whatever is needed in terms of resources, partnerships, and channel these resources and partnership towards the goals. So to a certain extent, it is a primary accountability of decision makers at every level, from the municipality, from the mayor, all the way up to the president or to the multilateral bodies like the UN General Assembly and so on. It is, there is a greater accountability of decision makers in creating the what we call the enabling environment, right? So all necessary conditions in order these goals to be achieved. However, as we mentioned before, since these goals are related to the socioeconomic sphere, they require also an adherence in terms of individual behaviors. When I look at what is making the main goals of UNFPA in sexual and reproductive health and rights, or the elimination of gender-based violence, lag behind, is primarily social norms, and social norms translate into individual behaviors. Something that becomes unacceptable for a community of individuals will eventually be translated into a legal framework. As a lawyer myself, I never forget what's the journey of a law. A law starts, the law is the crystallization of shared values, but those values start at the individual level, then they become a practice, a collective practice, because several individuals will adhere to those values. And then in the rule of law, those individual values that have become a group's practice or a community's practice are crystallized into a norm. So I think that we always need to look at these goals from the two sides. They are a political agenda that requires decision makers accountability and taking the responsibility to move it forward and mobilize the necessary resources and partnerships. But they also speak about the individual behaviors vis-a-vis each other. There would be no exclusion if there was an equitable distribution of wealth. But inequality comes primarily from the behavior of people who are not ready to share. And this starts, from inequitable fiscal systems to an inequitable distribution of profit or resources, or discrimination based on gender, race, whatever we want to look at, geography, ethnicity, and so on. So combining together this decision makers' accountability with individual responsibility and action is what is really going to make these goals become a reality for everyone in an equitable way. And so partnerships are essential, because if these goals represent a bit of a new social contract, where we commit that nobody should be hungry at the end of the day, where we commit that everyone has to have the same opportunity to go to school, fulfill its potential, make informed choices, and enjoy its rights, and so on, then of course we need all parts of society to adhere. Because, as I was mentioning before, an institution has to believe and take its responsibilities in its norm setting and monitoring responsibility. A private sector company should ensure equity in terms of salaries, not discrimination in terms of access to opportunity. Might that be physical access for people with disability, or no discrimination in terms of gender, race, sexual orientation, and so on. As well as the NGOs have to continue to do their job, looking at themselves as part of a system, and so should all development organizations do. So I do think that the recipe is in combining this individual responsibility with the collective accountability, each one of us in our role, personal and professional role. And when I say personal, it's the single behavior, the role as a parent, as a child. And this is where I want to make a reference to the inequality in terms of digitalization. It is true that there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of providing equitable access to digital tools, connectivity, and so on. But at the same time, a community of 1,000 people where 5 people have access has already acquired a public good through the knowledge that those 5 people are acquiring. Now, the question is, are those people instrumentalize their access, or are those people going to put that access at the disposal of the broader community? So we may say that 50% is inadequate and insufficient. It is, but it does represent a big opportunity, for example, when it comes to social norms. When I look at, until there was no connectivity in many communities, even only those 2 mobile phones, elders and religious leaders and the most conservative people in the community had the monopoly of information and knowledge on interpreting religious norms, for example. Now, just by a few people in that community having access to different perspectives, some of those norms, that's what we observe, start being challenged in the conversations around the table, around food, and everything doesn't necessarily need to take a social movement shape to plant the seeds for change. So that's where I tend to look at the opportunity we have to take while we remain aware of how to make this opportunity more equitable, greater access, and so on and so forth, because of the time we are left with. We have to leverage what we have while we work towards improving that.
Yeah, I want to also stress that when we talk about, for those who might not be as familiar, when we talk about digital inclusion and specifically digital equity, there are 3 pillars that we specifically as a program look at. We look at access to technology, which are the digital infrastructure, the tools, the internet. We also look at the second pillar, which is digital skills. And some people refer to this as digital literacy, but we think that digital skills is a bit more all-inclusive. And this is the knowledge of how to actually use and navigate the technology and the internet and the various services. And then the third bucket is what we call participatory and inclusive content. This is inclusion of marginalized communities in the design and creation of the technology, and also content that's accessible to these communities, that's specifically designed with them in mind and that they know how to relate to and navigate. So if content is there, but it's inaccessible because you don't know how to access it, then it is not participatory and or inclusive content. So we do look at those 3 pillars as important to build on all 3 of those to ensure that there's digital equity across the board. You can have access to technology, but not have the skills. And so your penetration into the internet and into the digital skills, or digital world tends to be lower. And so it is important to have all three of those. And with that, Mariama, I want to pull you into the conversation. When we, obviously we've heard a bit of the darker side and the reality and the challenge of the goals. And one of the questions actually in the chat box was around the failures or perceived failures of the MDGs that are the goals that in essence came before the Sustainable Development Goals, and why we didn't make progress and why didn't it materialize. And I would arguably say that the SDGs, because we have more goals and many more indicators and targets, and the goals were in essence brought to the world as a collaborative endeavor, no one sector can solve them alone. So as we're looking at the halfway mark on the progress towards the SDGs, can you give us some examples of some projects that you've witnessed that are actually changing and building momentum towards closing the digital gaps and actually addressing digital inequity in a sustainable way?
Yeah, thank you, Hazami. And you're so right. What a milestone to kind of take stock of where we are, but also keep that North Star of the SDGs so we know where we're headed. I'd like to first actually touch on a point that was mentioned in the discussion. A lot of these challenges are intersectional. And so the solutions as a result aren't just, for multilaterals, aren't just in the public sector, civil society, but really include all of us as individuals, as companies, really because we're all in this together. And so when I think of our progress so far with the SDGs, I am so inspired by so many partners that are doing great work in their communities, using their expertise to bridge the digital divide or the digital gap. I even think of the Accelerator, for example, some of the cohort 1 organizations that are working with women and girls, working with people with disabilities, essentially to get them online. So focusing on those 3 pillars you mentioned, there's the hardware component, there is the digital literacy component. So what do you do when you're actually online? But I'm also really excited by solutions that are outside, for example, HP's wheelhouse, like connectivity. So seeing all of these pieces come together at the local level, I think is what is so inspiring. And that's really the sweet spot of bridging the digital divide. How are we collaborating with one another? How are we keeping one another accountable? And I just really think of cohort 1 as doing such a great job, but you'll see excellent examples across the board, across many different geographies. One of the initiatives that we signed on to, I believe it was earlier this spring, was this great call to action from the US government, the White House, that was essentially empowering women and girls in sub-Saharan Africa. And to see all of the private sector commitments that came together, I think has already been inspiring to track the progress. So there are many ways that we can come together. Private sector has a role, but I'm very, very inspired by what's happening locally.
Yeah, and on the topic of partnerships, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the design of the goals, with the fact that goal 17 is called Partnerships for the Global Goals, has that very much built into the DNA. Brighton, I want to ask you to build on that point. Very specifically, the work that you all do is also elevating voices of local solutions and of local players and marginalized communities into the dialogue. Can you speak to what momentum you have seen growing, and specifically between the private, public, and NGO sectors, and what we can do to continue to invest into it?
Absolutely. I think Mariama did describe something very significant around creating synergies and alliances for transformation. Equally, Dr. Francesco described, how, the anthropogenic aspect of how we should perceive all these cascading challenges that we are facing with respect to digital access and digital equity. Within the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, our mandate is to accelerate youth solutions for the Sustainable Development Goals. How are we doing that? We work with about 4,000 young innovators. These are young computer scientists, young computer scientists, and just young artists. We run 2 fellowships. One is a year-long fellowship where we make early stage, social innovations investment ready. So currently we have young people that are taking part in the new agenda for sustainable development financing being hosted by President Macron in Paris. So we also give access to young people to engage in productive international dialogue and alliances with world leaders. And then every year, we also bring young people to the Vatican, where we create a space for intergenerational dialogue on human rights. So we fly about 100 young people, giving them access to different world leaders. Last year, we had Maya Motley, the president of Barbados, join us, and many other world leaders. So our mandate is to identify young people, irrespective of where they are, bring them into our programs, and give them the tools and skills which they need the most. In addition to that, we're also very excited. This year, we'll be hosting the Next Generation Leaders Summit here in New York at the United Nations. This is on the lead up to the Summit of the Future happening next year. So within the space, we are seeing that young people are organizing, young people are innovating, and young people are working together because they've realized that there is nothing for us without us. And it's within that framework of thinking that is allowing the cross-pollination of ideas and alliances and partnerships. I would like to also add something interesting. I think this event today coincides with the launch of the Sustainable Development Report, which we produce at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And this report has revealed very interesting aspects. So some of the key findings from the report include having Finland holding the top spot on this year's 2023 SDG index. So meaning they are meeting lots of their, specific targets. We have Denmark, Sweden, which falls on number 2, Denmark number 3, Germany number 4, and Austria number 5. What we're also seeing is that there's still a risk that the gap in SDG outcomes between high-income countries and low-income countries will be larger by 2030. So we're seeing that there's still a huge gap. And based on the current pace of progress we are making since 2015, none of the goals will be achieved by 2030. It sounds very pessimistic, but that's what the report reviews. And about less than 20% of the SDG targets are on track to be achieved. So this just shows us that there is need for this like north to south sort of collaboration in terms of like, how do we think about financing development? How do we think about identifying specific, like recovery pathways from the COVID-19 pandemic? One last thing I want to share is about what we've seen in this report. We've seen that Argentina, Barbados, Chile, Germany, Jamaica, and the Seychelles obtained the highest score on a new pilot index for their efforts to promote multilateralism. But yet, no country is still on course. So we're seeing quite a number of like very interesting findings, which reminds us that we still need to go back to the drawing board and establish how can we work together collaboratively to co-create solutions for sustainable development. One of my favorite old adage is that there's no time for a lone ranger. I think the time is long gone when somebody will fall from the sky and solve our problems. I think right now the greatest results are achieved through collaboration, cooperation, and co-creation.
When I want to take that and kind of maybe not to put a negative spin on it, but in essence say that without collaboration and co-creation, we will not achieve progress, because the reality is bits of the solution live within so many different communities, and it does require integration across multiple sectors. And while the governments and the UN system do have responsibility, our communities also have responsibility. One of the things that we look at when we look at gender divide, for example, is some of these issues are also cultural. There are also economic in reality. And so there's multiple intersectionalities across the SDGs, which to some people, they look at the SDGs and they're like, well, they're not achievable, because how are you going to solve the entirety of gender inequality, for example? But then you look at gender inequality and it touches on just about every single goal. And I want to actually pull some statistics from an article that Elizabeth and I, Elizabeth's one of our colleagues at the Aspen Institute, had written around the gender norms, and specifically the opportunities and the impact of digital exclusion on women. But looking at the report itself, it was a UN report from UN Women, that in 2021, the report found that it would take, that we grew closing the gender gap by 36 years in the space of 12 months. So if the world doesn't change its policy towards women, it will now take 135 years to close the gender gap around the world. And because of digital exclusion of women, we've also seen a $1 trillion loss in GDP growth in low and middle income countries. And so when we're starting to look at these numbers, there's an incentive, unfortunately, an economic incentive for governments and corporations to also think of these communities not as charity or good side projects, but rather core to the reality of sustainability of the planet. So Francesco, I want to ask you to talk to us about intersectionality of the goals and why we cannot solve for one issue without looking at all issues. And on the other hand, we can't allow ourselves to be overwhelmed because the problems are just so big. Can you speak to that?
Thanks a lot, Hazami. You actually give me an entry point into something that is very close to my heart and the heart of UNFPA, right? Which is demographics. Intersectionality starts from demographics. Who is where? What do they know? What's their age? And so on. That's why when people look at the population census as yet another technical data collection, I'm, here in Guinea, we are in the middle of the process, and we are trying with the government to make everyone knows that and understand that unless you're not counted, you will not count in the decision making. And so, demographics help us look at where people are, who they are, their sex and their age and, their ability or lack thereof and so on. And so it's essential to own data. And that is why, data are considered a key lever also for making digital transformation working for everyone, because it brings back that perspective you all were talking about of, we need to know who is excluded and where that person is and why that person is excluded in order to work together strategies to eliminate those obstacles to a large extent. And then I think that again, me, I'm an optimist and I like to look at the half full side of the glass. Intersectionality should lead us look at solutions from a systemic perspective, rather than, as we have done, even in international development over the past 70-something years, in a sectoral way. There's no individual looks at his or her life in a sectoral way. Oh, let me think about my education, and then now I'm going to think about food security. And now, no, people make their lives a system from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed, even in the different roles each of us play in our communities and the different identities we carry. So intersectionality translates into the complexity of the individual and the social dynamics. And so unless solutions are designed around the wealth of the elements that make a human being, we are not going to be able to maximize. Because again, the risk even now of catching up after COVID on some of the indicators is falling into self-complacence by saying, oh, we are on the right track. But my question is maximizing the effort, even when it comes to financing, to go back to, to Brighton's observation. The first question I ask myself as a manager of a pretty large program in a country, so, trying to contextualize in order not to feel overwhelmed, right? What is within my sphere of influence? Before going out and looking for more money, my first question is, am I maximizing the return on investment through partnerships, through complementarity of the money I'm throwing into the SDGs I'm responsible to contribute to? And I have the impression that this search for more money and better instruments and so on leaves us a little bit blind on the efficiency of the billions of dollars that have been thrown into international development. And this goes back to some of the questions that are coming up, right? We didn't achieve the MDGs. What makes us think we're going to achieve the SDGs? I mean, we need to change, we need a change of paradigm when it comes to international development and the intersectionality and looking at issues from a systemic perspective, I think can bring that greatest sense of efficiency of collaborative efforts and partnerships that are needed. Eventually also to mobilize more resources. But I would say that, more resources will come when the return on investment of the current resources proves right. There's also that aspect. People who are investing want to make sure they are investing in something that is not the usual throwing money out of the window and never being fully satisfied of what we did in terms of results. And that's where I come back with the last kind of pitch on data, is not only demographics, but it's also measuring our assumptions and correcting on the way. Because once again, we tend to count activities, we tend to count beneficiaries or people reached. That doesn't tell us the whole story. The full story comes with those qualitative analysis that you were mentioning before when it comes to equity and so on, but also to the quality of what we do and how our hypotheses turn to be right or wrong.
And that's excellent, Mariama. I want to kind of maybe if you can bring some color to some of what Francesco was talking about when it comes to specifically the partnerships and action on the ground. Can you speak to the kind of the momentum that you've seen built across on the ground, specifically across private, public, and NGO sectors? What has worked, and why do you think they did work, specifically looking at intersectional approaches to accelerate progress on multiple goals.
Yeah, thank you, Hazami. I'd say what makes these initiatives work best, at least from what I've observed, is really what Dr. Francesca just mentioned. Nothing happens in a silo. So let's say a company goes out to solve digital equity and is just focusing on one of the pillars that you mentioned. That solution in itself, though it may be effective, really does need more of an ecosystem involvement. So that's, of course, a partnership approach, working with nonprofits, working with entrepreneurs, working with government, working with public sector. But also what that means is thinking not just about the digital solution itself, but how does the end user experience this solution in life? To get a little bit more concrete, we've seen a lot of success with programs that recognize that it's not just a connectivity issue or a hardware issue or a digital literacy issue, but seeing how else does someone show up when it comes to education. When you're in the classroom, do teachers need support? Is there an intervention or a solution that can engage teachers in the learning process and the digitization process? Then you step back even further. Are there ways that we can empower parents? Are there ways we can empower the school systems as a whole? But then stepping even further back, is there a way that we can also think about climate? So social impact really focuses on people. And when we talk about digital equity, their access to technology. But what happens when we're sunsetting that technology? Is there a way to incorporate circularity so that those devices are being reused or repurposed in really conscious ways? When it comes to human rights, are there ways that we are connecting what we're doing in digital equity and climate to those areas? So the solutions that I've seen be really successful really think about the entire product life cycle, also think about the entire user experience, and also think about how our social impact is showing up in different pillars and areas. There was a question also about refurbishment, and I think the projects and initiatives that have been really successful globally have thought about these issues very intentionally. And so that's just an overview of what I've observed and seen, but really interesting point that goes back to that core that, you know, we really do need partnership to solve some of these really sticky, hairy, challenging problems related to reaching the SDGs by 2030.
There's also a question around kind of reaching those that are the hardest to reach. So vulnerable populations and rural communities living in poverty in parts of the world that are not as invested into as others. So I'll maybe open it up to all of you. Whoever wants to take the question is, how do you, with limited resources and with limited bandwidth and with limited attention spans, how do we start to think about reaching those that are the hardest to reach around the world? Maybe if each of you can take that.
Sure, happy to kick us off. I think it actually touches on things that my fellow panelists have mentioned. So first is the data. Do we know what the landscape is, where the problems are the most severe or the most felt? And then being able to prioritize in that way. On the other side of the data, I think it really does all come back to people, because these impacts affect real living, breathing people. So having the right people on your team and your partnerships that have that proximate experience to the problem that can co-create solutions with you are going to be completely and really intrinsically important to finding a solution. So it's really that nexus of, do we have the data to know where the problems are? And are we working with the people that have that lived experience and knowledge of the issues? And can we combine those two things to create solutions to tackle some of these challenges?
Sure, thank you so much. I think it's just been really amazing taking it in and listening to all the incredible contributions. And I think I want to summarize by looking back at where I'm coming from. My home country in Zambia. I grew up in a small peri-urban community in Zambia. And I remember having had access to the internet when I was, I think, in 7th grade, touching the first computer when I was, I think, in about 8th grade. So when I look back and reflect, it then reminds me of how, despite that having happened a few years back, there's still that continuation of disparities. And I then begin to think about this young person I met. She was about, 12 back in my hometown. And during the time of the pandemic, she never had access to go to school. The teachers didn't even have any digital infrastructure to provide online learning. She didn't have access to a mobile phone for her to be able to learn. Meanwhile, the only thing that she was able to do was to just carry out house chores. For 2 months, never had any access to education. And I'm sitting in New York City, where when I think about the abundance of resources in like the majority of the population, every young person has got a digital gadgets. They can stay at home. They have access to the internet. They can continue to learn. And then when I look at this huge gap, it then reminds me of specific privileges. How do we think about this young girl that I met in my hometown? And for individuals like you and myself who have the opportunities and privileges, how can we be able to stand up for those individuals who have less? I think that's more on a very personal level. And I think we need to start from there as we think about the institutions that we are leading, the institutions that we belong to. And in addition to that, we have 2 billion people that don't have access to the internet. How do we think about those individuals on a more personal level? Because like, Dr. Francesco described, the specific policies, regulations are created by the social norms which become acceptable. If we accept that other people should have less, then those are the social norms that are going to define the decisions that are made even in public institutions, in governments, and in international organizations. I think it's thinking about those individuals that we leave behind. In my case, I think about, that young person I met in my hometown and how I can change the lives of just one single individual for them to have access to opportunities for them to learn and become whatever they want to become professionally and personally. All right, yeah.
So my 2 cents, I think that first and foremost, unfortunately, inclusion is not yet a reflex of society. So we still need a deliberate effort to leave no one behind. Because the human beings tend to look at those who are similar to them. There's always a sense of sharing among homogeneous groups before looking at others. And so first and foremost, we should make sure those of us who are committed to this work that wherever instinct fails, intent brings us back on the right track. The other issue around being left behind relates to feeling invisible. Of course, we will not be able as a society, even when we break it down, we break action down to the smallest level of a community or a family, we will never be able to provide every single individual with the same access, opportunity, resources. We will always have to make choices, right? But one thing is to associate people to the decisions of what to prioritize, making sure that everyone understands that prioritizing doesn't mean it's more important. It means should be done first. It's a matter of sequencing. When it comes to opportunities, when it comes to resources, prioritizing is not a matter of importance. It's a matter of sequencing. Because we stand up for universal access to human rights for everyone. So nobody is more important. No right is more important. However, in a world of finite resources, we have to sequence. Now, when people are associated to that sequencing, they will stop feeling invisible. A parent who's put in front of a choice on using resources for him or herself or to give opportunity to their child, they will probably choose to give the opportunity to their child. As a matter of fact, they will be left behind by making that choice, but it will be a choice of prioritizing the opportunity of their kids first, because maybe from that, the opportunity to that kids, there will be a positive return on them. So making people who are in a position of vulnerability part of the decision, so not making them invisible, is the first step to make them feel they are not left behind, but they are part of the choice of choosing where to start from. I think this is so, so important. From a conversation in the most remote community about their local development plan, or what all we have learned in development in the past decades, to the biggest conversation at national level, multilateral level. And this naturally involves people who represent different groups and stakeholders. And so it naturally talks about intersectionality and partnerships. Because when a community, no matter the scale, agrees on what to prioritize, that will translate into the private sector, the NGOs, and behaviors and actions, if all are held accountable to the same values of equality, and particularly equality of access to the opportunities, right? Breaking the invisible obstacles. That, for me, it's probably important to keep in mind, because I go back to my first statement, unfortunately, is not instinctive yet. It's an intentional act.
And we have amazing questions in the chat box that unfortunately, due to time, we will not be able to get to. But as my colleague Elizabeth just posted in the chat box, please do sign up for additional events. We are going to be hosting a series of these conversations in the lead up to the upcoming United Nations General Assembly, where conversations around the SDGs and digital inclusion will be central to a lot of the dialogues. I'm going to give everybody 30 seconds, and I mean 30 seconds. What is the one thing that you think we need to do to invest more into closing the digital divide? One thing, 30 seconds. Mariama, go.
Took me 20 seconds to unmute. I'd say it really does go back to that partnership. We can solve this if we work together. And so finding those diverse partners, not being afraid to collaborate, that I think is the key.
Francesco, go.
Well, as with friends in the social movements before I joined the UN used to say, no matter the question, the right answer is always education. I would add to that, of course, data. So to make education aware of where to intervene. But I think when we see the low investment in education and health, we see where the problem starts.
Wonderful. And Brighton?
We need resilience. We are confronting challenging issues. And resilience and determination is what we would define whether we persist or we relent.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for not only your amazing voices on these topics, but for your work and the things that you're doing to actually bring to life and bring to fruition everything that you talked about here. You are all people that walk the walk every single day of your life. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for the work that you are doing. And thank you to the audience for being so engaged and the excellent questions. Hopefully we answered some of them. I know some of them we did not get to, but stay in touch with us. My colleague did send out information in the chat box. You can sign up on our newsletter and learn more about our upcoming opportunities. But with that, thank you again for all of our speakers, and thank you to our audience and to my wonderful colleagues at the Aspen Institute behind the scenes, helping make this webinar a reality. So thank you, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you next time.